December 18, 1904, Norfolk, Virginia. The train whistle pierced the gray December afternoon as Thomas Harrison stared through the frost-webbed window at the passing Virginia countryside. Snow had begun to fall, delicate flakes swirling in the wind that howled across the barren fields. "We'll be arriving shortly, sir," the conductor said, startling Thomas from his thoughts.
"Thank you,"
Thomas replied, adjusting his hat. The telegram still sat heavily in his coat pocket. Uncle Frederick deceased. Presence required for reading of will. Harrison Estate, December 19th. Thomas barely remembered Uncle Frederick, a stern-faced man who had visited them only once when Thomas was a child. A wealthy businessman who had made his fortune in coal, Frederick had been the black sheep of the family, rumors of his ruthlessness in business and private life following him like shadows. The Harrison estate had been in the family for generations, but Thomas had never visited it. His father had refused to speak of his childhood home, changing the subject whenever Thomas had inquired. "Some places are better left forgotten," his father had once said, his eyes distant with unspoken memories. As the train pulled into the Norfolk station, Thomas gathered his belongings and stepped onto the platform. The cold bit through his coat as he searched for his ride. "Mr. Harrison?" A thin, elderly man approached, his gaunt face partially hidden beneath a woolen scarf. "I'm Walter Simmons, your late uncle's solicitor." The carriage ride was silent save for the crunching of snow beneath the wheels and the occasional snort from the horses. The buildings of Norfolk gradually gave way to sprawling countryside until they turned onto a narrow road lined with bare trees, their skeletal branches reaching toward a dimming sky. "How did my uncle die?" Thomas finally asked. Simmons hesitated. "Heart failure," the doctor said. "He was found at the foot of the cellar stairs." "The cellar?" "Yes," Simmons replied, his voice dropping, "though it's been bricked up for years. No one goes down there anymore." "Not since ... double quotes," he trailed off as the Harrison estate came into view, a looming Victorian mansion of weathered red brick and dark wood, its windows like vacant eyes staring out across the snow-covered grounds. "Your uncle was the last resident," Simmons continued. "The staff departed after his death. You'll be alone tonight, I'm afraid. I can return tomorrow for the reading of the will." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Who else will be present tomorrow?" "Just yourself, Mr. Harrison. You're the sole heir." As the carriage approached the house, Thomas noticed a shadowy figure watching from an upstairs window. But when he looked again, the window was empty. "Mr. Simmons," Thomas said, unable to tear his gaze from the house. "What did you mean when you said 'not since'? What happened in the cellar?" The solicitor's face paled. "Just family stories, Mr. Harrison. Nothing worth repeating." But as Thomas stepped from the carriage and faced his inheritance, this brooding mansion with its secrets, couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by eyes that were not entirely alive. "One last thing," Simmons added, handing Thomas a heavy iron key. "Your uncle was most insistent that under no circumstances should anyone attempt to open the bricked-up cellar entrance. It was his final request." Thomas took the key, wondering why he would need it if the cellar was sealed. As the carriage departed, leaving him alone before the massive front door, a whisper seemed to emerge from the house itself, a voice carried on the wind that sounded eerily like his father's. "Some places are better left forgotten." December 18, 1904, evening. The Harrison estate groaned under the weight of decades. Thomas stood in the grand foyer, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor as he surveyed his inheritance. Dust sheets covered the furniture like pale ghosts, and the air hung heavy with the scent of mothballs and wood polish. As Thomas removed his hat and coat, hanging them on an ornate rack by the door, the house was surprisingly warm. Someone had lit fires in the main rooms before departing. As he moved through the ground floor, he noticed how meticulously everything had been maintained, as if Uncle Frederick had been preparing for visitors who never came. In the study, Thomas found a decanter of brandy and poured himself a glass. Family portraits lined the walls, stern-faced Harrisons dating back generations, their eyes seeming to follow him as he paced the room. He recognized his father in one of the paintings, a young man with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. A leather-bound book lay open on the desk. Thomas approached and saw it was a journal, the neat handwriting dated December 25, 1895. Another Christmas, another tragedy. "Eleanor found dead this morning near the cellar door. Heart failure, the doctor claims, but I know better. It's happening again." Thomas frowned. The entry continued on the next page, but someone had torn it out. He flipped through the journal, finding more missing pages, particularly around Christmas dates. A sudden crash from upstairs made him start. Setting down his glass, Thomas climbed the grand staircase, the wood creaking beneath his feet. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding small in the vastness of the house. No answer came, but as he reached the landing, he heard what sounded like footsteps retreating down the corridor. "Is someone there?" Thomas followed the sound, past closed doors and faded wallpaper, until he reached what must have been his uncle's bedroom. The door stood ajar. Inside, a large four-poster bed dominated the room. The covers were disturbed, as if someone had recently lain there. A shattered glass lay on the floor beside the nightstand, the source of the crash he had heard. Thomas knelt to pick up the pieces, noticing a photograph that had fallen as well. It showed a family grouped on the mansion's front steps. A stern-looking man he recognized as a younger Uncle Frederick, a beautiful dark-haired woman, and 3 children. The date on the back read Christmas 1880, as he replaced the photograph on the nightstand. Thomas noticed a small leather-bound book tucked under the pillow. Opening it revealed another journal, this one filled with increasingly paranoid entries. December 22, 1903. I hear them at night, scratching at the bricks. The wall will not hold forever. I've instructed Simmons to ensure it remains sealed after my passing. The pattern must not continue. Thomas closed the journal, a sense of unease settling over him. What pattern was his uncle referring to? And who had been found dead by the cellar? As night fell, Thomas made himself a simple dinner from the supplies left in the kitchen pantry. The house creaked and settled around him as he ate alone in the vast dining room meant for dozens. Outside, the snow continued to fall and wind whistled through cracks in the old window frames. After dinner, drawn by a morbid curiosity, Thomas found himself standing before a blank wall in the corridor leading to the kitchen. Unlike the rest of the house's rich wood paneling, this section was red brick, clearly newer than the surrounding structure. A heavy padlock secured a chain that had been threaded through an iron ring mounted on the wall. This must be the bricked-up cellar entrance. Thomas touched the cool surface of the bricks. Was it his imagination, or was there a faint vibration beneath his fingertips? A barely perceptible sound, like breathing, seemed to emanate from behind the wall. He stepped back quickly, his heart pounding. As he turned to leave, the gas lamps in the corridor flickered, and for a moment, Kunis thought he saw a dark stain spreading across the floor from the base of the bricked wall, a stain that looked horribly like blood. When he blinked, it was gone. That night, as Thomas lay in a guest bedroom, unwilling to sleep in his uncle's bed, he was certain he heard footsteps in the corridor, soft at first, then more urgent, followed by what sounded like scratching at his door. And beneath it all, barely audible but unmistakable, came a sound from somewhere deep in the house, the rhythmic tap of bricks being removed, one by one. December 19th, 1904. Morning. Thomas awoke to sunlight streaming through a gap in the heavy curtains. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was, then the events of the previous day came flooding back. He checked his pocket watch, 8:15 a.m. Simmons would be arriving at 10 o'clock for the reading of the will. As Thomas washed and dressed, he tried to dismiss the unsettling experiences of the night as nothing more than an overactive imagination, fueled by travel exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the old house. In daylight, the Harrison estate seemed less menacing, merely a neglected relic of faded glory. After a breakfast of stale bread and preserved fruit, Thomas decided to explore more of the house. The upper floors revealed bedrooms long unused, furniture shrouded in dust sheets. One room, clearly once a nursery, contained toys frozen in time wooden horses, a rocking chair sized for a child, a dollhouse that was an exact miniature replica of the Harrison estate itself. Thomas knelt to examine the dollhouse. Through its tiny windows he could see diminutive furniture arranged in perfect imitation of the rooms below. Even the bricked-up wall was represented, a patch of red against the dollhouse's white interior walls. He opened the miniature cellar door, surprised to find it wasn't sealed like its full-sized counterpart. Inside was a small compartment containing tiny handcrafted figures, a family of 5, each face painted with remarkable detail. Thomas recognized his uncle and the woman from the photograph. The 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, bore the distinctive Harrison features. As he held the figures, Thomas noticed something disturbing. Each one had a red line painted around its neck like a wound. A knock at the front door startled him, and he nearly dropped the figures. Hastily, he returned them to the dollhouse and headed downstairs. Walter Simmons stood on the porch, briefcase in hand, snow dusting his shoulders. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison. I trust you slept well." Thomas hesitated. "Well enough, thank you." Simmons followed him to the study, where a fire was already burning in the grate. Thomas couldn't recall lighting it. "Before we begin," Simmons said, arranging papers on the desk, "there's something you should know about your family history." Thomas took a seat opposite the solicitor. "I'm listening. The Harrisons have owned this property since 1832. Your great-grandfather built this house, but its foundation and the cellar dates back to colonial times." Simmons adjusted his spectacles. "There has been A pattern of unusual deaths in your family, Mr. Harrison. Always at Christmas. Always near the cellar entrance. I found mentions of that in my uncle's journal, Thomas said. What happened? Simmons sighed, suddenly looking much older. It began with your great-grandfather's youngest daughter in 1855. She was found Christmas morning at the foot of the cellar stairs. The official cause was a fall, but there were ... inconsistencies. Then, in 1868, your grandfather's brother was found in the same spot. Heart failure, they said. And it continued, Thomas prompted. Simmons nodded. Your father's sister in 1880, your cousin Eleanor in 1895, and now your Uncle Frederick Call found by the cellar entrance, all at Christmas. My father never spoke of this. He left as a young man and never returned. He was wise to do so. Simmons opened his briefcase. Now to the matter at hand. Your uncle's will is quite straightforward. As the last living Harrison, you inherit everything. The estate, his business holdings, considerable financial assets. Thomas listened as Simmons detailed the inheritance, a fortune that would make him one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. But there were conditions. Your uncle requires that you reside in the estate for at least 1 week before claiming the inheritance, including Christmas Day. Simmons avoided Thomas's gaze. And you must ensure that the cellar remains sealed. Why would he ask that of me? What's in the cellar? Simmons closed his briefcase with a snap. I cannot say. Your uncle never discussed it, even with me. I only know that after his sister's death in 1880, he had the entrance bricked up and never spoke of it again. As Simmons prepared to leave, Thomas asked the question that had been troubling him since his arrival. Mr. Simmons, who was the woman in the photograph with my uncle and the children. The solicitor paused at the door. That would be your Aunt Isabel, your uncle's wife. The children were their own William, James, and little Margaret. I wasn't aware my uncle had a family. Few are. Simmons's face was grim. They all perished in the winter of 1880. An illness, it was said, though they died within days of each other. Only Frederick survived. It was after their deaths that the incidents at Christmas began. After Simmons departed, Thomas stood in the foyer, the weight of family secrets pressing down on him. Outside, the sky had darkened again with approaching snow. 6 days until Christmas. 6 days to uncover what had happened to his family and what waited behind the bricked-up wall. That afternoon, as Thomas searched through his uncle's papers, he found a faded newspaper clipping from December 1880. Tragedy strikes Harrison family. The article described how Isabel Harrison and her 3 children had died of an unidentified fever, but a quote from a housemaid caught Thomas's attention. They were fine at dinner. It wasn't until Mr. Harrison took them to see his new wine cellar that they fell ill. By morning, only he remained unaffected. Thomas stared at the article, a chill running down his spine. Whatever lay behind that bricked wall, he was now certain of one thing. His uncle hadn't sealed the cellar to keep something out. He had sealed it to keep something in. December 20th, 1904, a winter storm had descended overnight, blanketing the Harrison estate in a thick layer of snow. Thomas stood by the study window, watching as wind sculpted drifts against the bare trees. The house felt even more isolated now, cut off from the rest of the world by the unrelenting white. After his conversation with Simmons, Thomas had spent hours sifting through his uncle's papers, searching for any information about the sealed cellar and the family deaths. He'd found little beyond vague references and the newspaper clipping about his aunt and cousins. Today he decided to interview the estate's former staff. Simmons had provided their addresses in Norfolk, and Thomas was determined to venture into town despite the weather. But first he needed to examine something that had been nagging at him since his arrival. Thomas returned to the nursery and the dollhouse he'd discovered. In daylight, he noticed details he'd missed before: tiny red handprints on the interior walls of the miniature cellar, and what appeared to be scratch marks around the dollhouse's cellar door. He removed the family figures again, studying their painted faces. The red lines around their necks weren't just decorative. They were deliberately crafted to look like wounds. And now he noticed something else. Each figure had a date inscribed on the bottom. Isabel, December 24th, 1880, William, December 23rd, 1880, James, December 22nd, 1880, Margaret, December 21st, 1880, the dates of their deaths 1 day apart. And today was December 20th. Thomas placed the figures back in the dollhouse, his mind racing. If his uncle's family had died in sequence leading up to Christmas Eve, and others had died on Christmas Day in subsequent years, was there a pattern he was missing? The storm eventually subsided enough for Thomas to make his way into Norfolk. His first stop was a small house on the outskirts of town, home to Martha Collins, who had been the Harrison family's housekeeper for 40 years until Frederick's death. Martha was a thin, white-haired woman with alert eyes that narrowed suspiciously when Thomas introduced himself. "I never thought I'd see another Harrison at my door," she said, reluctantly inviting him inside. Her modest home was warm and smelled of baking bread. They sat at her kitchen table, steam rising from cups of tea between them. "Mrs. Collins, I need to know what happened in that house," Thomas said. "What's behind the bricked wall?" Martha's hands trembled slightly. "I don't know what's behind it, sir. No one does. Mr. Frederick had it sealed after they died, and no one was ever to speak of it. But you must have seen something, heard something." She stared into her tea. "I remember when he built it, that cellar. It was the summer of 1880. He hired foreign workers, men who couldn't speak English. They dug for weeks, deeper than any normal cellar needs to be. What was it for? He said it was for wine storage. But double quotes, Martha hesitated. The night they completed it, I heard Mr. Frederick talking to someone down there. When I asked who it was, he said I was imagining things." Thomas leaned forward. "And his family? What happened to them?" Martha's expression darkened. It wasn't an illness that took them, no matter what the papers said. Miss Isabel had been concerned about her husband's behavior for months. He would disappear into that cellar for hours, come up looking different. Different how? Like he wasn't himself anymore. Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. "The night before little Margaret died, December 20th. Like today, I heard her screaming about Papa's new friends who were cold and hungry." Thomas felt a chill run through him. "Do you think my uncle harmed his family?" Martha shook her head. "Not directly, but he brought something into that house, Mr. Harrison. Something that shouldn't have been disturbed." As Thomas prepared to leave, Martha grabbed his arm. "Don't stay there for Christmas. Whatever took them is still there, waiting behind that wall. Every Christmas it takes another Harrison. It won't stop until the family line ends." "What is it, Mrs. Collins? What's in the cellar?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. But the night before Mr. Frederick bricked up the entrance, I heard him begging for forgiveness. He said he didn't know what would happen, that they had promised him wealth and power, not death." "Who had promised? Who was he talking to?" "No one was there, Mr. Harrison. That's what frightened me the most." On his return to the estate, Thomas found himself studying the family portraits with new eyes. He noticed now that in the paintings dated after 1880, Uncle Frederick looked subtly different, his eyes harder, his posture more rigid, as if he were being held upright by invisible strings. That evening, as darkness fell early and heavy snow resumed, Thomas sat in the study with his uncle's journal open before him. He discovered a hidden compartment in the desk containing earlier volumes, including entries from 1880. July 15, 1880. The excavation is complete. Deeper than expected, but they were right. It was there, just as the old maps indicated. The original settlement's meeting house, buried by time and earth, and beneath its floorboards, the chamber they described. "I have made the offering as instructed. Now I wait. August 3rd, 1880. Success. They have accepted my terms. Wealth beyond imagining in exchange for annual tribute. A small price to pay. December 20th, 1880. Something is wrong. They have taken Margaret. This was not our agreement. They want more than I offered." The entries grew increasingly frantic, culminating in a final entry on December 24th. "They are all gone now. Isabel was the last. I have sealed the entrance, but I can still hear them calling to me. They say the pact cannot be broken, that a Harrison must pay the tribute each Christmas or something worse will emerge. God forgive me for what I've done." As Thomas closed the journal, the house seemed to sigh around him, and from somewhere deep within its walls came a sound he had been dreading since his arrival, the soft, persistent tapping of something trying to get out. December 21st, 1904, Thomas awoke with a start, heart pounding. The bedroom was pitch dark, the fire having died hours ago. Something had pulled him from sleep, a noise or a presence felt rather than seen. He reached for the matches on his nightstand, but his fingers found only empty space. "Looking for these, Mr. Harrison?" The voice, gravelly and low, came from the corner of the room. Thomas froze as a match flared to life, illuminating the weathered face of an elderly man seated in the room's only chair. His clothes were those of a laborer, his hands gnarled from years of work. "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. "How did you get in here?" The old man lit the bedside lamp, his movements unhurried. "His name's Samuel Watts. I've been caretaker of the Harrison grounds for 50 years. Mr. Simmons told me you were here." Thomas relaxed slightly. "Why didn't you announce yourself yesterday?" "I've been watching you, Mr. Harrison. Needed to see what kind of man you are." Samuel's eyes, surprisingly sharp in his aged face, studied Thomas. "You've been asking questions in town." "About the cellar." Thomas sat up in bed. "Do you know what's behind that wall?" Samuel was silent for a long moment. "I helped your uncle brick it up. Christmas night, 1880. He was half mad by then, covered in blood that wasn't his own." The old caretaker moved to the window, pulling back the curtains. Outside, the world was still dark, but the snow had stopped, and a thin moon cast silver light across the grounds. This land is old, Mr. Harrison. The estate sits on what was once a settlement called Blackwood, founded by those seeking freedom from certain constraints of the church. In 1692, the same year as the Salem trials, Blackwood vanished. Every resident disappeared overnight. Thomas joined Samuel at the window. What happened to them? The official record says an Indian attack, but the truth. Samuel turned to face Thomas. Your great-grandfather knew. He found journals from the settlement's founder while digging the estate's foundation. They spoke of rituals performed in a hidden chamber beneath the meeting house. Rituals to entities older than Christianity. And my uncle found this chamber, Thomas concluded, remembering the journal entries. Samuel nodded. Frederick was always ambitious, always wanting more than life had given him. When the family fortune began to decline, he became desperate. He found the old maps in your great-grandfather's papers and became convinced that the settlement's benefactors could restore the Harrison wealth. What were these entities? Thomas asked, though part of him didn't want to know. The settlers called them the Waiting Ones, ancient things that offer gifts in exchange for tribute. Samuel's voice dropped. Your uncle made a pact with them, but he didn't understand the price. Thomas thought of the dollhouse figures with their red-lined throats. His family, it started with little Margaret. Frederick found her in the cellar on the morning of December 21st. Her throat had been cut, but there was no blood. It had been ... consumed. Samuel's hands trembled as he continued. Then James the next day, William after that. By Christmas Eve, when he found Isabel the same way, Frederick finally understood what he'd done. He sealed the chamber to contain whatever he'd awakened, Thomas said. He tried. Samuel's expression was grim, but the pact had been made. Every Christmas since, the Waiting Ones have claimed another Harrison. Your uncle believed as long as the wall stood, they couldn't fully emerge, but they could still reach through somehow, take their tribute, and retreat again. Thomas remembered the journal entry. A Harrison must pay the tribute each. Christmas or something worse will emerge. Why are you telling me this now? Thomas asked. Because today is December 21st, Mr. Harrison, the anniversary of little Margaret's death. Samuel gestured toward the bedroom door. And there's something you need to see. Thomas followed Samuel through the dark house to the nursery. The old caretaker pointed to the dollhouse, which now stood open, though Thomas was certain he had closed it. Inside, the Margaret figure was missing from the cellar. Where is it? Thomas demanded. Samuel silently led him downstairs through the kitchen corridor to the bricked-up wall. There, placed carefully at the base of the wall, sat the tiny wooden figure of Margaret Harrison, and around its neck the painted red line now glistened wet in the lamplight. It's beginning again, Samuel whispered. They know a Harrison has returned. As if in response, a faint scratching sound emanated from behind the wall, like small fingers trying to dig their way out. December 21st, 1904. Afternoon, we need to leave, Thomas insisted, backing away from the bricked wall. Now, before nightfall. Samuel shook his head, his weathered face solemn in the lamplight. It won't matter. They've sensed you now. Distance won't save you. The Harrisons who fled all met the same fate, just in different places. Your father was the only one who survived, and only because... Because what? Thomas pressed when the caretaker hesitated. Because your uncle offered a substitute 1 year. A young woman from town who worked in the house. Samuel wouldn't meet Thomas's eyes. Your father was meant to be the tribute that Christmas, but he left 2 days before. Frederick grew desperate. Thomas felt sick. My uncle murdered an innocent woman to save himself. To fulfill the pact, Samuel corrected, though his expression showed his disgust. A life was required, but not necessarily a Harrison. After that, Frederick researched obsessively, looking for a way to end the cycle permanently. Did he find anything? If he did, it would be in his private records. Samuel gestured toward the upper floors. There's a hidden study behind his bedroom. Few knew of its existence. The hidden room proved to be accessible through a concealed door in the back of Frederick's wardrobe. Inside, Thomas discovered a small, windowless space lined with bookshelves. A desk covered in papers occupied the center, illuminated by the lamp Samuel had brought. I'll leave you to it, the caretaker said. I need to check the grounds, make sure everything's secure. Alone in the hidden study, Thomas began examining the materials his uncle had gathered. Ancient texts on folklore and occult practices filled the shelves, many in languages Thomas couldn't identify. On the desk lay more recent documents, letters, research notes, and what appeared to be transcriptions from the original Blackwood settlement journals. One transcription caught Thomas's attention. April 17, 1692. The Waiting Ones have shown their true nature. They demand more than we can give. Dietrich attempted to renounce the pact and was found flayed. His blood drained into the chamber floor. We cannot defeat them, but perhaps they can be bound. The ritual requires a willing sacrifice of the bloodline that summoned them. Thomas continued searching, finding a letter from a professor at Miskatonic University dated 1898. Dear Mr. Harrison, regarding your inquiry about binding rituals for chthonic entities, the text you referenced suggests such beings can indeed be permanently confined through willing blood sacrifice of their summoner's lineage. However, I must caution that these accounts are considered allegorical rather than literal instructions. If, as your letter implied, you are dealing with an actual manifestation, I strongly advise... The rest of the letter had been burned away. More disturbing were Frederick's personal notes from 1903, the handwriting increasingly erratic. The pattern is clear. They take one Harrison each Christmas, working backward through the bloodline. After I am gone, only Thomas remains. When he falls, the binding will fail completely, and the waiting ones will be free to emerge beyond the chamber. What I began in ignorance will culminate in catastrophe, unless the cycle is broken. Thomas set down the papers, his mind reeling. According to these documents, he wasn't merely the next victim in a series of family murders. He was the final sacrifice that would allow these entities to fully manifest in the world. As evening approached, Thomas returned downstairs to find Samuel stoking a fire in the main hall. Did you find what you needed? The caretaker asked. My uncle believed I'm the last sacrifice, Thomas said. That once I'm gone, whatever is behind that wall will be free. Samuel nodded grimly. That matches what he told me in his final days. He said he'd found a way to end it, but needed time to prepare. Then he was found dead by the cellar wall. There's more, Thomas continued. The documents suggest a willing sacrifice of the summoners. Bloodline could bind these things permanently, meaning you, Samuel said quietly. Yes, my death, freely given, might end this. Thomas paced before the fire, but there has to be another way. Your uncle thought so. He was researching methods to transfer the pact to another bloodline. Samuel hesitated. There's something else you should know. I haven't been entirely forthcoming with you. Thomas stopped pacing. What do you mean? I didn't come here just to warn you. Your uncle left instructions. A letter to be delivered to you if you ever return to the estate. Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age. Why didn't you give this to me immediately? Thomas demanded. I needed to be sure you understood the gravity of the situation first, Samuel replied. What this letter proposes. It's not a decision to be made lightly. Thomas broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Recognizing his uncle's handwriting. Thomas, if you are reading this, then I have failed to break the cycle, and you have inherited both fortune and curse. What I awakened in 1880 cannot be destroyed, only contained or transferred. I have discovered that the pact can be renegotiated on the winter solstice, December 21st, when the veil between worlds is thinnest. Beneath the floorboards of the hidden study is a box containing the original pact, written in blood on human skin. With it are instructions for the transference ritual. It requires the blood of the current bondsman yourself, and the willing consent of another to assume the obligation. I could not find someone willing to take on this burden. Perhaps you will succeed where I failed. If not, the only alternative is the binding ritual. Your willing sacrifice at the bricked entrance on Christmas Eve would seal the waiting ones for eternity. The choice, nephew, is yours. May God forgive us both. Frederick Harrison Thomas looked up from the letter to find Samuel watching him intently. Today is the winter solstice, Thomas said. Yes, Samuel replied. If you wish to attempt the transference, it must be tonight. Thomas returned to the hidden study and located the loose floorboard his uncle had mentioned. Beneath it lay a small iron box, its surface etched with strange symbols. Inside, wrapped in blackened cloth, was a piece of what Thomas recognized with horror as human skin, covered in spidery writing that seemed to shift and move in the lamplight. Accompanying it was a smaller parchment with instructions for the transference ritual, a ceremony that required blood from both parties and words in a language Thomas couldn't pronounce. As he examined these grim artifacts, a sudden realization struck him. Samuel had known exactly where the hidden study was. He knew intimate details of the pact and the family history, and he had arrived precisely on the winter solstice with Frederick's letter. He was looking for someone to take the burden, Thomas murmured to himself. Someone who understood the danger... Thomas gathered the ritual materials and descended to the main hall, where Samuel waited by the fire. Night had fallen completely now, and outside a strange stillness had settled over the snow-covered grounds. I've made my decision, Thomas announced, clutching the iron box. I won't transfer this curse to an innocent. Nor will I sacrifice myself without understanding exactly what we're facing. Thomas took a deep breath. Tonight, we're going to open the wall. December 21st, 1904. Night, you can't be serious, Samuel said, his face paling in the firelight. Opening that wall would be suicide. Perhaps, Thomas acknowledged. But I need to see what my uncle awakened. If I'm to make a decision about my fate and possibly the fate of others, I need to understand what we're dealing with. You don't understand the risk, Samuel insisted. Those things have been contained for 24 years. If we breach the wall, if the documents are correct, they can already reach through to claim their tribute, Thomas interrupted. The wall is a barrier, not a prison. And tonight on the solstice, the barrier is at its weakest. Thomas placed the iron box on a table and faced the old caretaker. You've served my family for 50 years, Mr. Watts. You knew my uncle's secrets. Now I'm asking for your help, either to face what's behind that wall or to find someone willing to take on the pact. Samuel was silent for a long moment, conflict evident in his weathered features. Finally, he nodded. I'll help you open the wall. But I warn you, what we find may be beyond your worst nightmares. They gathered tools from the groundskeeper's shed, a sledgehammer, crowbars, and lanterns with extra oil, as they worked their way through the house to the bricked entrance. Thomas noticed the air growing progressively colder, their breath fogging before them despite the fires burning in the grates. The small wooden figure of Margaret still sat at the base of the wall, its painted face eerily serene. As Thomas reached to move it, Samuel caught his wrist. Don't touch it, he warned. It's a conduit now. They positioned their lanterns to illuminate the wall. The brickwork looked solid, but as Thomas examined it more closely, he noticed thin, dark stains seeping from between the bricks like old blood that had never quite dried. Where should we begin? Thomas asked. Samuel pointed to an area near the center of the wall. Here. This section was added last, according to your uncle. Thomas raised the sledgehammer, hesitated for a breath, then swung it against the wall. The impact sent a shudder through the bricks, and dust cascaded from the ceiling. Again and again he struck, until finally a brick dislodged, tumbling to the floor with a dull thud. Immediately a cold draft whispered through the opening, not blowing outward as expected, but pulling inward, as if the space beyond was inhaling. With it came a scent of damp earth, mold, and something metallic that Thomas recognized with instinctive revulsion as old blood. Keep going, Samuel urged, his voice tight with apprehension. Thomas worked methodically, widening the hole until it was large enough for a man to step through. Beyond lay darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow their lantern light. Samuel handed Thomas a lantern. I'll go first, he offered, but Thomas shook his head. This is my family's burden, he said. I'll go. Thomas stepped through the opening, holding the lantern high. Stone steps led downward, worn smooth by passage of feet long ago. The walls were rough-hewn rock, glistening with moisture that reflected the lantern light like thousands of watching eyes. Samuel followed, his breathing labored in the thick air. We should be reaching the original cellar soon, he whispered. The stairs seemed to descend far deeper than should have been possible, spiraling down beneath the foundations of the house. Finally, they opened into a larger chamber, the wine cellar his uncle had supposedly constructed in 1880. Empty racks lined the walls thick with dust and cobwebs, but what drew Thomas's attention was the floor. The stone had been removed in the center, revealing another set of stairs leading still deeper, these carved directly into the bedrock. The original meeting-house cellar, Samuel murmured, and below that ... the chamber, Thomas finished. As they approached the second staircase, Thomas noticed symbols carved into the surrounding stone-crude figures that hurt his eyes to look at directly, seeming to shift and change when not observed. Your uncle added those, Samuel explained. Containment symbols from the books he studied. They were meant to strengthen the binding. The wooden figure of little Margaret suddenly appeared at the top of the stairs. Neither man had brought it, yet there it stood, its painted eyes now seeming to watch them intently. Thomas felt a chill run through him. It's moving on its own. We're being invited down, Samuel said grimly. The deeper stairs were treacherously steep and narrow. Thomas descended carefully, the lantern casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, carrying a metallic taste that coated Thomas's tongue. The stairs ended in a small antechamber with a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands gone green with verdigris. Carved into the door was a single word, pactum. The pact, Thomas translated. This is where my uncle made his bargain. The door had no visible handle or lock, but as Thomas approached, it swung inward of its own accord, revealing the chamber beyond. Thomas raised his lantern, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The chamber was circular, perhaps 30 feet across. its walls decorated with faded paintings depicting robed figures engaged in rituals around a central pit. The floor sloped gently toward this pit, a perfectly round hole about 6 feet in diameter that descended into impenetrable blackness. Around the pit's circumference were 7 stone pedestals, each holding a different object: a knife with a bone handle, a silver chalice blackened with age, a leather-bound book, a small wooden box, an iron key, a human skull, and an empty pedestal that appeared to be waiting for something. "The ritual implements," Samuel whispered. "Used by the original settlers, then by your uncle." Thomas approached the pit cautiously. Unlike the rest of the chamber, no dust or cobwebs marred its perfectly circular edge. The stone there was worn smooth, as if by countless hands. "Do not step too close," Samuel warned. "That pit has no bottom." As Thomas held his lantern over the edge, trying to penetrate the darkness below, a sound emerged from the depths, a soft, rhythmic pulsing, like a massive heart beating far below. "What's down there?" Thomas asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "The waiting ones," Samuel replied. "Not their physical forms, those are elsewhere in spaces between spaces. But their awareness reaches through the pit." Thomas turned to examine the chamber more thoroughly. Against one wall stood a crude altar of stacked stones. Its surface was stained dark brown, and grooves had been cut into the stone, leading to a small hole that emptied directly into the pit. "The sacrifice site," Samuel explained unnecessarily, "where the blood tribute is made." Near the altar, Thomas noticed markings on the floor, not ritual symbols, but words carved by desperate hands. "Forgive us," they lied, "God cannot see here," and most disturbing of all, scratched in what appeared to be dried blood, "They wear our faces when we die." As Thomas stepped back from these grim discoveries, his foot struck something on the floor. Looking down, he saw the dollhouse figures of William and James, their painted eyes now open and staring up at him. "They're all going to be here by Christmas Eve," Samuel said quietly. The entire family reunited for the final sacrifice. Thomas felt a sudden rage building within him, at his uncle for his greed, at the settlers who had first opened this doorway, at whatever entities waited below for his blood. "There has to be a way to end this without another death," he insisted. "Your uncle thought so too," Samuel replied. "He spent decades searching for an alternative." Thomas approached the pedestals, examining each object carefully. The leather book drew his attention, its pages filled with entries dating back to 1692, written in different hands but all describing the same pact: wealth and power in exchange for blood. The final entry was in his uncle's handwriting, dated December 24th, 1880. "I have paid with the blood of my family, but still they want more. A Harrison each Christmas until the line ends. Then they will be free to take physical form through the pit, wearing our faces as masks. I cannot destroy them, but perhaps they can be bound more completely. The transference ritual offers one hope: to shift the burden to another bloodline. But who would knowingly accept such a curse? The binding ritual requires my willing sacrifice, but I am a coward. I cannot bring myself to end my life, even to correct my terrible mistake. So I seal the chamber and pray the brick wall holds. May God forgive me, though I cannot forgive myself." Thomas closed the book and turned to Samuel. "My uncle was right. There are only 2 options: transfer the pact or complete the binding with a willing sacrifice." A soft sound from the pit interrupted them, voices whispering, just below the threshold of comprehension, growing steadily louder as if rising from great depths. "They sense your presence," Samuel said urgently. "We should leave now." As they turned to go, Thomas noticed something emerging from the darkness of the pit, thin, pale appendages like fingers, but too long, too numerous, reaching upward toward the chamber's edge. "Run!" Samuel shouted, shoving Thomas toward the door. They fled up the stairs, the whispering voices growing to a cacophony behind them. As they reached the antechamber, the wooden door slammed shut of its own accord, cutting off the sound instantly. Thomas and Samuel didn't slow their pace, climbing the second staircase and racing across the wine cellar to the bricked opening. Only when they had passed through and collapsed, panting, in the corridor of the main house did they pause to look back. The hole they had made in the wall was now completely filled, not with the bricks they had removed, but with the dollhouse figures of Margaret, William, and James, their tiny wooden bodies fused together to seal the breach. And on the corridor floor before them lay the figure of Isabel, waiting for tomorrow. December 22nd, 1904, dawn broke over the Harrison estate, pale winter sunlight doing little to dispel the shadows that seemed to have deepened overnight. Thomas sat in the study, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, his mind replaying what he had witnessed in the chamber beneath the house. Samuel entered, looking haggard. Neither man had slept. The figure of Isabel is gone, the caretaker reported, and James has appeared by the wall. Thomas nodded wearily, following the pattern. Today's December 22nd, the day James died in 1880. We don't have much time, Samuel said, taking a seat opposite Thomas. By Christmas Eve, all the figures will have moved into position. And on Christmas Day, double quotes, he didn't need to finish. They both knew what would happen if they didn't. Thomas would be found dead beside the bricked-up cellar, his blood drained as tribute, and the waiting ones would be free to emerge fully into the world. I've been reviewing the documents, Thomas said. The transference ritual requires the blood of the current bondsman the willing consent of another to assume the obligation. Samuel's expression remained carefully neutral. Finding someone to take on such a burden would be nearly impossible. Unless, Thomas said slowly, studying the older man's face, that person had their own reasons for wanting the pact. A tense silence fell between them. What are you suggesting, Mr. Harrison? You knew too much, Mr. Watts, about the chamber, the ritual, everything. You arrived precisely on the solstice with my uncle's letter. And you've served the Harrison family for 50 years without ever leaving, despite knowing what lurked beneath the house. Thomas leaned forward. You want the pact for yourself. The question is why? Samuel's weathered face revealed nothing for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a thin, cold expression that transformed his features. Your uncle was not the fool I took him for, he finally said, his voice different now, more cultured, less the simple groundskeeper. He must have left more detailed notes than I realized. Who are you really? Thomas demanded. Samuel Watts died in 1879, the man replied. I assumed his identity after your uncle's discovery. I've had many names over the centuries. I was Jonathan Blackwood before that, the founder of the settlement your estate now stands upon. Thomas felt his blood run cold. That's impossible. That would make you over 200 years old. 238 to be precise, the man said. The pact has its benefits, Mr. Harrison, longevity being chief among them. You were the one who first contacted these entities, Thomas realized. You made the original pact. The waiting ones found me, not the other way around, Blackwood corrected. I was a man of humble origins who dreamed of more. They offered power, wealth, influence, everything I desired in exchange for a small tribute. Blood sacrifice is hardly small, Thomas said bitterly. It began with animals, Blackwood shrugged. But their appetite grew. Eventually they demanded human blood, the blood of my followers. When I refused, they took my family instead. Sound familiar, Mr. Harrison? Thomas remembered the journal entries. So you transferred the pact to another bloodline. Several times over the centuries, Blackwood nodded. Each time following the same pattern, find a greedy, ambitious man, whisper secrets of power in his ear. Lead him to make the pact, then offer to take it back when the price became too high. And my uncle was your latest victim, Thomas concluded. Frederick was particularly susceptible, Blackwood said, no remorse in his voice. The family fortune was dwindling. He was desperate to restore it, to secure his children's future. Ironic, considering what it cost him. So you guided him to the chamber, helped him make the pact, then watched as his family died. Thomas said, disgust evident in his voice. Why didn't you take the pact back from him? I tried, Blackwood replied, but something went wrong. Your uncle discovered my true identity before the transfer could be completed. He refused to complete the ritual and sealed the chamber instead, thinking he could contain the waiting ones. But they still claimed their tribute each Christmas, Thomas said. A Harrison each year, but only on Christmas and only one. A compromise, Blackwood explained. As long as they received their due, they remained partially bound. But with each death, the binding weakens. When the last Harrison dies, you, Mr. Harrison, they will be free to fully emerge. Unless I complete the binding ritual, Thomas challenged. My willing sacrifice would seal them forever. Blackwood's expression darkened, and robbed me of everything I've built over 2 centuries. The pact has given me extended life, Mr. Harrison. Without it, I would age to dust in moments. So you need me to transfer the pact back to you before Christmas, Thomas realized. That's why you're here. Precisely, Blackwood smiled. And in return, you get to live. You walk away from this house free of the curse with your uncle's fortune intact. A fair exchange, wouldn't you say? Thomas considered the man before him, this centuries-old deceiver who had caused the deaths of countless innocents, including Thomas's own family members. And if I refuse, then you die on Christmas Day, Blackwood said simply. And the waiting ones emerge, wearing the faces of your family. The world as we know it ends. Is that what you want, Mr. Harrison? What guarantee do I have that you'll keep them contained once the pact is yours again? Thomas asked. Self-interest, Blackwood replied. I have no desire to see them fully manifest. Our arrangement has worked well for centuries. They get their tribute, carefully selected by me, and I retain my extended life and the other benefits of the pact. Other benefits? Influence, Mr. Harrison, the ability to shape events, to accumulate wealth across generations. How do you think I've survived all these years? I've been president's advisors, king's confidants. I've shaped nations from the shadows. Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds of the estate. Somewhere beneath his feet, the waiting ones listened, anticipated, hungered. I need time to consider, he finally said. The winter solstice has passed, Blackwood reminded him. But the transference can still be performed on Christmas Eve, when the veil is thin again. You have until then to decide. As Blackwood rose to leave, Thomas turned to face him. One more question. The dollhouse and the figures, what are they? Sympathetic magic, Blackwood explained. A reflection of the real world that allows the waiting ones to influence it. Your uncle created them as a warning system to track the movements of what lies beneath. After Blackwood departed, Thomas returned to the hidden study, searching desperately for anything his uncle might have left that could help him escape this impossible choice: die to save the world or live at the cost of allowing a monster to continue sacrificing innocence. As evening fell, Thomas found himself standing before the bricked wall once more. The figure of James sat at its base now, and beside it, newly appeared, was the figure of William. 2 days left, Thomas whispered to the empty corridor. What would you have me do? From behind the wall came a soft tapping sound, almost like a response. December 23, 1904, the day dawned gray and bitter cold. Ice formations creeping across the windows like skeletal fingers. Thomas had spent the night in the study, surrounded by his uncle's research, searching for a third option beyond sacrifice or transfer. By morning he had found nothing, only confirming what he already knew. The pact could be transferred to a willing recipient, or it could be broken with the willing sacrifice of the last bondsman. There was no other way. The William figure had vanished from the corridor, and now the tiny wooden replica of Frederick himself sat by the bricked wall. Tomorrow would bring Isabel, and then on Christmas Day, Thomas knew what he had to do, though the thought filled him with dread. He sent word to town requesting Simmons's presence, then spent the day putting his affairs in order. The solicitor arrived late in the afternoon, his thin frame hunched against the cold. Mr. Harrison Simmons greeted him anxiously. Your message sounded urgent. Is everything all right? I need to make a will, Mr. Simmons, Thomas said directly. Immediately. The solicitor's eyebrows rose. A will? But you've only just inherited, nevertheless, Thomas interrupted. I need it done today. They worked through the afternoon, Thomas dictating his wishes while Simmons drafted the document. The bulk of the Harrison fortune would go to charitable foundations, with specific provisions for the maintenance of the estate, which was to remain uninhabited but preserved as a historical site, the bricked cellar wall never to be disturbed. Mr. Harrison Simmons said hesitantly as he prepared the final draft, these provisions. They sound as if you don't expect to. Just ensure everything is legally binding. Thomas cut him off. And I need one more thing from you. This letter is to be delivered to the authorities if anything happens to me. He handed Simmons a sealed envelope containing his account of everything he had discovered, including Blackwood's true identity and crimes. After the solicitor departed, promising to return the next day with the completed documents, Thomas began making preparations for what he now knew must be done. From his uncle's hidden study, he gathered the materials needed for the binding ritual, the ancient text describing the process, ceremonial items, and most importantly, the iron knife with strange symbols etched into its blade. As darkness fell, he heard the front door open and close. Heavy footsteps crossed the foyer. I know you're here, Blackwood, Thomas called out. Come in. The centuries-old man entered the study, brushing snow from his coat. His eyes immediately fell on the ritual items Thomas had laid out on the desk. I see you've made your decision, Blackwood said, his voice neutral. I have, Thomas confirmed. I'll transfer the pact to you. Surprise flickered across Blackwood's features, quickly replaced by satisfaction. A wise choice, Mr. Harrison. Self-sacrifice is noble but ultimately futile. The world continues with or without us. On one condition, Thomas added. You tell me everything about the waiting ones. What they truly are, what they want. No more half-truths. Blackwood considered this request, then nodded. Fair enough. You deserve to know what you're escaping. He settled into a chair by the fire. The entities you call the waiting ones are ancient, older than humanity, older perhaps than Earth itself. They exist in spaces adjacent to our reality, able to influence but not fully manifest without assistance. What do they want? Thomas pressed. To exist in our world, Blackwood said simply. They feed on life, human life specifically, its energy, its essence. In their realm, such sustenance is scarce. Here it's abundant. And the pact? A doorway of sorts? Not wide enough for them to step through entirely, but enough to reach through and take what they need. Blackwood's eyes reflected the firelight oddly. The blood tribute sustains them, and in return they grant certain enhancements to their bondsmen. Like your extended life, Thomas noted. And other abilities, Blackwood added. Influence over minds, knowledge of things hidden, a certain immunity to harm. Useful gifts for a man with ambition. At the cost of innocent lives, Thomas said bitterly. Blackwood shrugged. People die every day, Mr. Harrison. At least these deaths serve a purpose. How many? Thomas asked. How many have you sacrificed over the centuries? I stopped counting after the first 100, Blackwood admitted without a trace of remorse. But I've been selective criminals. The terminally ill, those who would not be missed. Like the servant girl my uncle killed to spare my father. Blackwood's expression hardened. Choices in desperate times are rarely clean. Your uncle broke our arrangement when he sealed the chamber. The pattern of taking Harrison's was never the intent, merely the consequence of his interference. Thomas stood, moving to the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, thick flakes swirling in the darkness. The ritual will take place tomorrow night, he said finally. Christmas Eve, when the veil is thinnest. Excellent, Blackwood replied, standing to leave. I'll make the necessary preparations. As he reached the door, Thomas called after him one last question. You mentioned the binding ritual would seal the waiting ones forever. How can you be sure? Blackwood paused. Because it was attempted once before, in 1692. A woman from the settlement, my wife, actually discovered what I had done. She tried to complete the binding ritual, offering herself as sacrifice. What happened? I stopped her, Blackwood said flatly. But not before she'd begun the process. That partial binding is why the waiting ones cannot fully manifest even now. Why they require a bondsman to reach through. After Blackwood left, Thomas returned to the bricked wall. The Frederick figure sat there, joined now by William, James, and Margaret. Only Isabel remained to complete the set. I'm sorry, Thomas whispered to the tiny effigies of his murdered family, but I promise you, this ends tomorrow night. He reached out and carefully collected the figures, each one unnaturally cold to the touch. For what he planned, he would need them all. December 24th, 1904. Christmas Eve. The day passed in a blur of preparation and grim determination. Thomas refined his plan, reviewing the texts on both the transference and binding rituals until he could recite them from memory. Walter Simmons arrived at noon with the completed will, which Thomas signed without hesitation. Mr. Harrison, the solicitor said, concern evident in his voice, I must ask, is there something you're not telling me? These provisions suggest everything is in order, Mr. Simmons, Thomas interrupted. Thank you for your service to my family all these years. As Simmons reluctantly departed, Thomas noticed the Isabel figure had appeared at the foot of the main staircase. The complete set was now in place. The final warning before his own death would be required on Christmas Day. Thomas gathered all 5 figures and placed them in a small wooden box, which he tucked into his coat pocket. As dusk approached, he made his way to the cemetery on the estate grounds, where generations of Harrisons lay buried. Among these snow-covered headstones, he found what he was looking for. A small family plot containing 4 markers. Isabel Harrison, beloved wife and mother, 1850 to 1880. William Harrison, cherished son, 1870 to 1880. James Harrison, beloved son, 1872 to 1880. Margaret Harrison, darling daughter, 1875 to 1880. Thomas knelt in the snow before the graves. I know what happened to you, he said quietly, and I promise you, it ends tonight. Returning to the house, Thomas found Blackwood waiting in the study, a black bag at his feet. Are you ready? The centuries-old man asked. Almost, Thomas replied. The ritual must be performed in the chamber, correct? Blackwood nodded. Where the pact was made. We'll need to reopen the wall. Together they cleared away the bricks, exposing once more the passage to the underground chamber. This time, Thomas noted, there was no resistance, no mysterious sealing of the breach. The waiting ones wanted them to enter. They descended in silence, Blackwood leading the way with confident steps, clearly familiar with the path. When they reached the chamber with its central pit, Thomas paused at the threshold, steeling himself for what was to come. The chamber appeared exactly as before, but Thomas sensed a difference in the atmosphere, a tension, an anticipation that hung in the air like static before lightning strikes. The whispering from the pit was louder now, almost comprehensible. They're eager, Blackwood commented. unpacking ritual items from his bag, a silver bowl, ceremonial daggers, vials of liquid. They sensed the transferences at hand. How does the ritual work? Thomas asked, though he already knew. Simple in principle, Blackwood explained. Blood from both participants, freely given. The current bondsman renounces the pact, while the new bondsman, myself, accepts it. A few words in their language and it's done. And I walk away free, Thomas said. No consequences? None, Blackwood assured him. The Harrisons will no longer be marked. You can live out your life in peace. Wealthy beyond measure thanks to your uncle's fortune. Thomas approached the central pit, gazing down into its impenetrable darkness. From below came that steady, pulsing sound, like a massive heart beating in anticipation. And if I chose the binding ritual instead? He asked casually. Hypothetically speaking. Blackwood paused in his preparations. That would be foolish beyond measure. Your death would seal the waiting ones forever, yes, but you would lose everything, your life, your future, the fortune you've inherited. While you would lose your extended life, Thomas noted. I would die within minutes, Blackwood confirmed, his voice hardening. 2 centuries of age would claim me all at once. A difficult choice, Thomas mused. Not particularly, Blackwood countered, returning to his preparations. Few men choose death when life is an option. When all was ready, Blackwood stood before the altar, the silver bowl positioned to catch their blood. Shall we begin? Thomas approached slowly, reaching into his coat as if to remove something needed for the ritual. Instead, he withdrew the small wooden box containing the 5 dollhouse figures. What are you doing? Blackwood asked, confusion crossing his features. Completing the circle, Thomas replied, opening the box. He placed each figure on the edge of the pit. Margaret, James, William, Isabel, and Frederick. My family has paid enough for your pact, Blackwood. It ends tonight. Understanding dawned in Blackwood's eyes, followed quickly by fury. Don't be a fool, Harrison. The binding ritual requires your willing sacrifice. Your death, I'm aware, Thomas said calmly, drawing from his coat the iron knife with its strange symbols, the ritual blade his uncle had prepared. I'll stop you, Blackwood snarled, lunging forward. But as he moved, the chamber shuddered. The whispering from the pit rose to a shriek, and dark, elongated appendages, too numerous to count, burst from the darkness, wrapping around Blackwood's legs. What's happening? Blackwood cried, struggling against the grip of the waiting ones. This isn't possible. You said it yourself, Thomas replied. The binding ritual was attempted once before, by your wife in 1692. She began the process before you stopped her. Thomas held up the knife. This was hers, wasn't it? Already prepared with her blood, her intent. All it needed was the blood of the last bondsman, the last Harrison. Blackwood's eyes widened in horror as he understood. No, you can't. I found the complete ritual description in my uncle's papers, Thomas continued, his voice steady, despite the chaos unfolding before him. He discovered what your wife had attempted, and realized the binding could be completed with the willing sacrifice of the last Harrison. They'll drag me down with them. Blackwood screamed, now being pulled inexorably toward the pit by dozens of pale, grasping limbs. It's the point, Thomas said. You made the original pact. You're as much a part of this as they are. More appendages emerged from the pit, now reaching toward Thomas. But unlike those grasping Blackwood, these merely hovered around him, waiting. They can't take me unless I give myself willingly, Thomas realized aloud. The final sacrifice must be freely chosen. Blackwood was now half submerged in the pit, clawing desperately at the stone edge. Please, he begged. Don't do this. Thomas looked at the 5 wooden figures arranged around the pit's edge, representations of the family destroyed by greed and dark pacts. Then he looked at Blackwood, the man who had orchestrated it all across centuries of manipulation and murder. My uncle tried to break the cycle by sealing the chamber, Thomas said. But some evils can't be contained, only ended. With steady hands, Thomas drew the ritual blade across his palm, letting his blood Harrison blood drip onto each wooden figure. As the droplets touched the tiny effigies, they seemed to come alive, their painted eyes moving to focus on Thomas. With my blood freely given, Thomas recited from the ritual text, I bind what was unbound. With my life, freely offered, I close what was opened. The chamber began to shake violently, stones dislodging from the ceiling. The darkness in the pit seemed to churn and boil as Blackwood sank deeper, his screams growing fainter. Thomas felt a strange peace settle over him as he completed the ritual. With my death, freely accepted, I end what was begun. He plunged the knife into his heart. Pain blossomed, sharp and immediate, then quickly faded to a distant sensation. Thomas fell to his knees beside the pit, blood flowing from his wound. Around him the chamber was disintegrating, walls cracking, the ceiling beginning to collapse. The wooden figures glowed with an inner light, their small forms elongating into ghostly approximations of his murdered family members. These spectral forms gathered around Thomas as his vision began to dim. The last thing he saw was Blackwood's face, contorted in hatred and fear, disappearing into the churning darkness of the pit. Then the pit itself began to close, not like a door shutting, but like reality folding in on itself, sealing away the space where the waiting ones had reached through for so long. As Thomas's consciousness faded, he felt gentle hands lifting him, carrying him upward through the collapsing chamber, up the stairs, through the passages rapidly filling with debris. His last thought, as darkness claimed him completely, was of peace. A family obligation finally fulfilled, a cycle of horror finally broken. Epilogue. December 25th, 1904, Christmas Day, Walter. Simmons approached the Harrison estate with dread in his heart. The letter Thomas had given him, to be opened if anything happened, had troubled him deeply. Its contents, tales of ancient pacts, entities from beyond, and centuries of murders, seemed the product of a disturbed mind. Yet something in Thomas's manner yesterday had convinced Simmons that the young man truly believed he was in danger, and so the solicitor had returned on Christmas morning, half expecting to find another Harrison dead beside the bricked-up cellar wall. What he found instead was a house in ruins. The rear portion of the mansion had collapsed entirely, as if the earth beneath it had simply given way. Dust still hung in the air, and the scent of disturbed earth permeated everything. "Mr. Harrison," Simmons called, picking his way cautiously through the debris-strewn foyer. No answer came. The area where the bricked wall had stood was now completely buried beneath tons of rubble, as if the house itself had sealed whatever lay beyond. Simmons searched for hours but found no trace of Thomas Harrison. No body, no blood, nothing to indicate what had happened in the night. As he prepared to leave and notify the authorities, something caught his eye, a small wooden box sitting untouched amid the destruction on what remained of the main hall floor. Inside were 5 small wooden dolls, meticulously crafted to resemble a family. But unlike the figures Thomas had described in his letter, these showed no signs of trauma. The red lines around their necks were gone, their painted faces peaceful. And a 6th figure had joined them, a young man with Thomas's features, his expression serene, his hand resting protectively on the shoulders of the smallest figure. Walter Simmons closed the box, tucked it carefully into his coat, and stepped out into the Christmas morning sunlight. Behind him, what remained of the Harrison estate settled into silence, its secrets finally at rest, its ghosts finally at peace,